Assalamu alaikum everyone. This is Salman Anjum at my YouTube channel, and we are talking about cell. We have been defining different properties and functions of the cell. We have talked about parts of the cell. We have talked about a very important function inside the cell, which was protein synthesis. We also discussed the role of four different organelles in relation to protein synthesis. And the topic today is energy processing by the cell. So we know production of energy and processing it is very important. It is fundamental because without energy, no activities are possible. Even protein synthesis is not possible without energy. So energy is a force, it is a drive. And if you remember, what was the chemical that cells they produce ultimately to reserve as energy source? That was ATP. So how cells are making ATP and how cells are related to energy processing? Of course, cells they contain organelles who are related to this energy kind of function. And in this context, we'll talk about the role of two important organelles. One is named as mitochondria and second one is chloroplast. They have a different role, but the role is ultimately to produce energy. So if we move on, so first one is mitochondria. So mitochondria, again, just like other organelles, is present inside the cell. So if I draw the cell for you, this is the cell. This time I'm not showing other organelles, just like nucleus is present here and ribosome or whatever other organelles are present. This time I'll simply show you the mitochondria, let's say, because we want to focus on mitochondria. So there is this mitochondria present, and this mitochondria, it also has two membranes. If you remember, nucleus was having two membranes. So mitochondria also has two layers of membrane, first thing. Second, what mitochondria is doing. So you remember we eat different kind of food. One of them is carbohydrate, and carbohydrate they contain glucose. So glucose from our blood, let's say this is glucose from the outside the cell comes inside the cell, and this glucose then goes inside mitochondria, and then mitochondria they break down glucose to produce ATP. So this glucose inside the mitochondria is converted into carbon dioxide and water. So of course, in order to burn this glucose, you also require oxygen. Of course, we are breathing and we are inhaling oxygen. So these two things, they enter into mitochondria, and then inside they react together to produce carbon dioxide and water. But this is not the purpose of burning glucose just to produce carbon dioxide and water, but alongside they produce energy, which is ATP. So you can mention the equation this way, that glucose plus oxygen gives you carbon dioxide plus water plus ATP. So this chemical reaction is happening inside the mitochondria, and it's a very important function. Okay, there is a very interesting fact regarding mitochondria, and that fact is that the mitochondria they are Of course, they are the organelle and they are present inside the eukaryotic cell. They are not present in the prokaryotic cell because they have two membranes and there is no organelle except ribosome present in the prokaryote. So that means the mitochondria, they are also present in only in eukaryotes. So the interesting fact is that the size of the mitochondria is the size of bacteria. And the studies have shown interesting facts that the mitochondria, they also contain DNA inside. We remember that the nucleus is the one that contains DNA. It is fine. But the mitochondria, they also contain its own DNA. And this study tells us that evolutionarily, these mitochondria were actual bacteria. And these bacteria, they entered to get some food, they entered into the eukaryotic cell. Because we remember from the size comparison slide that the eukaryotic cells, they are roughly 10 times larger in size than the size of the bacteria. And so the bacteria can enter into the eukaryotic cell. So these mitochondria, they were before, when they were not inside eukaryotic cell, they were living like a bacteria, and they entered into the eukaryotic system, into the eukaryotic cell, and they started living here, and then they became part of the eukaryotic system. So the witness is the presence of this DNA. There is no other organelle except nucleus that contains the DNA, but this is the one, mitochondria, that contains DNA. And I'll let you know the same interesting fact about chloroplast that also contains the DNA just like mitochondria. So having a size like bacteria and having its own DNA proves that they were evolutionarily bacteria who have entered into eukaryotic cell. So if we go back to the slide, so mitochondria, now we know that they are membrane bound organelle. They have two membranes, inner and outer, as I have drawn for you. And this chemical reaction is happening. Sugars like glucose, they're being broken down to produce energy. Energy means ATP. And energy is generated in the form of ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. And mitochondria, they are of the size of bacteria and they have their own DNA as well as the ribosomes. That means the protein synthesis is also happening inside the mitochondria because they were once bacteria, and bacteria, they produce protein and they have the DNA. So the mitochondria, they have their own DNA and ribosome. And of course, they can divide within the cell. We know that cells, they divide, but mitochondria, they can divide even inside the cell because they were once bacteria and they still retain their own job, their own function. Like bacteria, they divide, so mitochondria, they also divide at their own. And they don't need the permission of the cell to divide. Yeah, very interesting. And this is how they look like, the inner membrane and the outer membrane. Okay, then we move on to some sort of similar organelle, which is chloroplast. But the opposite thing is that the chloroplasts are the organelle which are present in the plants, and their job is to basically capture the sunlight. So that means they are absent from animals because we cannot capture sunlight. We cannot synthesize glucose the way plants can do. So we cannot perform photosynthesis. Right. So that means the chloroplast, they are capturing the sunlight, which is the radiation form of energy, and converting the radiation form of energy into a chemical which is glucose. So let's say I draw the cell here. This time I'm drawing a plant cell, so you can draw cell wall as well. And inside here you can draw a chloroplast. Let's say this is a chloroplast having two membranes, inner and outer. This contains inside a green pigment that is called chlorophyll, and this chlorophyll has the capability to capture the radiations which are coming from the sun. And by using this sun energy, the chloroplast can produce glucose. By using carbon dioxide, so carbon dioxide the plants they absorb through the leaves, and then they absorb water from the roots, and energy is coming from the sunlight, and as a result they are producing glucose plus oxygen, and this oxygen they liberate out in the environment, which is very, very important for us. So it is exactly the opposite reaction that was happening in the mitochondria. So, but it does not mean that mitochondria are absent in the plants. Mitochondria, they are present both in animals as well as in plants, because the breakdown of glucose was happening in the mitochondria, and that reaction is called respiration. And respiration is happening in every system, in every eukaryotic system, like plants or animals. That means mitochondria are present everywhere, whether plant or animal. But the chloroplast, they are performing photosynthesis, and they are only present in plants, and they are not present in animals. And so this is the same glucose that the chloroplast they produce, and this glucose then goes into mitochondria to be broken down to produce ATP. Or we also eat plants to get this glucose, and then we can also use our mitochondria to break down this glucose. Even plants, they can use their mitochondria, of course they use to break down this glucose to produce ATP. But who is synthesizing this glucose? It is chloroplast. So there is your slide. So chloroplast, they are found in plants, algae, and some bacteria. They have chloroplast. They are absent from animals. Chloroplast, they contain colored pigment known as chlorophyll, which has the capability to absorb sunlight for photosynthesis reaction, as I have shown you before. And chloroplast, just like mitochondria, they also have two membranes. Plants, they can make their own food by obtaining energy from the sunlight, and the reaction is called photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, plants, they produce sugars like glucose and oxygen by using carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water, as I have mentioned the equation, the chemical equation for you. And the sugars, the glucose, the produced is utilized by mitochondria then ultimately to produce ATP. And this is how they look like. So you can see these coin-like things, the stacks of coins, they are basically stacks of chlorophyll, the green pigment. And because of this chlorophyll, the plants, they look green and they can absorb sunlight, and the chemical reaction is happening here in the chloroplast. And you can also see double layered membrane. One is inner membrane and second one is outer membrane. An interesting fact about chloroplast is that they are also the size of bacteria, exactly like mitochondria, and they also have their own DNA inside. They also have their own ribosome inside, and they also divide within the cell of the plant. So that means they were also evolutionarily some bacteria who enter into plant cell, and they started living inside the plant. So plant is using them to produce glucose, and as a result they are also getting energy from the plant. They are living inside they're getting protection by the plant cell. So mitochondria and chloroplast, they both have their own DNA, they both have their own ribosomes, and they are believed to be once bacteria who entered into the eukaryotic system, and they are performing their own important reactions, and they both are performing opposite chemical reactions. One is producing glucose, second one is breaking down glucose. So it was the topic about energy processing by two different cells. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask me. Thank you so much.